king of thieves, known for his impeccable planning and unshakable confidence, had pulled off the unthinkable. He and his crew had just stolen over $100 million in diamonds from the world's most secure vault. But as the sirens blared in, the distance and the shadows of the law closed in, his carefully orchestrated heist began to unravel. With his team of specialists, a genius hacker, a master locksmith, and a getaway driver with nerves of steel, the plan had seemed flawless. Yet, one small mistake set off a chain reaction, leaving them on the run in a high-stakes game of cat and mouse that would push them to their breaking point. The diamonds were in their hands, but would they escape with their lives? The Antwerp Diamond Center, located in the heart of Belgium's Diamond District, was a fortress of unparalleled security. Known to be the most secure vault in the world, it housed over $100 million worth of diamonds, gold, and other priceless gems. The vault was not just a place of immense wealth, but a symbol of the diamond trade's importance, and it was protected by layers of complex security measures. It was a place few ever thought could be breached. Armed guards patrolled the premises at all hours, and the vault itself was equipped with cutting-edge technology designed to thwart any attempted break-ins. Every square inch of the building was monitored by cameras, and a team of highly trained security personnel oversaw every detail of the operation. The vault had been designed with redundancy in mind. No single failure in the system could compromise its integrity. It wasn't just the physical security measures that made the Antwerp Diamond Center so secure. The building was equipped with advanced biometric security systems including retina scanners, fingerprint recognition, and voice identification, all working in tandem to ensure that only authorized personnel could access the vault. Additionally, the vault itself was constructed from layers of reinforced steel and concrete, built to withstand bomb blasts and even attempts to drill into it. But beyond the technology, the vault was surrounded by a network of underground tunnels, secret passageways, and hidden exits, which provided an extra layer of protection against any potential attack. The Antwerp Diamond Center was, in essence, a maze built to keep the world's most precious stones safe. For years, it was widely accepted that no one would ever be able to breach the vault. The building had been in operation for decades, and despite a few attempted heists over the years, none had ever succeeded. It had become known as the Fort Knox of Diamonds, a title that reflected not only its impenetrable security, but also the priceless treasures it contained. The diamond trade in Antwerp was vital to the global economy, and the city had become a hub for dealers, traders, and thieves alike. But no one had ever come close to pulling off a robbery as audacious as the one that would shake the world to its core in 2003. On the night of February 15, 2003, as the streets of Antwerp grew quiet and the city settled into its usual late-night calm, a crew of thieves gathered in secret. These weren't the typical criminals one might expect. This was a team of highly skilled operatives led by a man who had become notorious in the world of organized crime. Known only as the King of Thieves, he had a reputation for pulling off the most daring and well-planned heists in the world. His previous crimes had involved meticulous planning, deep knowledge of security systems, and flawless execution. The King of Thieves wasn't just a thief. He was a master strategist, a man who saw heists as art and had perfected his craft over years of study and experience. The crew he had assembled was just as impressive. Each member of the team had a specific skill set that made them indispensable to the operation. There was the locksmith, a quiet and methodical man with an unmatched ability to open any lock no matter how complex. The hacker was a young woman with a genius-level understanding of electronic security systems, capable of bypassing even the most advanced software. The getaway driver, a man with nerves of steel, had planned several successful escapes in the past, ensuring that his team would never get caught. And then, there was the King of Thieves himself, a mastermind who had orchestrated every detail of the operation. For months, the team had been studying the Antwerp Diamond Center. They had meticulously mapped out every inch of the vault's design, including the building's security systems, the guards' routines, and even the structural weaknesses in the walls and floors. They discovered that while the vault was impenetrable from the outside, there was one crucial vulnerability: the system's reliance on a complex network of underground tunnels that connected various buildings in the area. Some of these tunnels, unknown to most, led directly beneath the vault. It was this discovery that provided the key to their plan. The King of Thieves and his team knew they had a limited window of opportunity to execute their heist. The vault's security was only as effective as the people who operated it, and there were always moments of routine or vulnerability that could be exploited. The plan was set. They would enter through one of these underground tunnels, bypass the external security systems, and gain access to the vault. The crew was confident that once inside, they would be able to disable the vault's alarms and steal the diamonds without ever being detected. It was a near-perfect plan, and if executed properly, it would go down in history as the greatest heist ever committed. As the night grew darker, the crew moved into position, each member of the team playing their part with precision. The King of Thieves had already anticipated every possible complication, and the crew had rehearsed their roles over and over. Everything was in place. What they didn't know was that despite their careful planning, they had overlooked one tiny but critical detail, something that would eventually lead to their downfall. But for now, as the clock ticked toward midnight, they remained confident that they had the perfect plan. The King of Thieves had spent years honing his craft, and the Antwerp Diamond heist would be the crowning achievement of his criminal career. As the night of the heist approached, his crew had become a well-oiled machine, each member confident in their role and ready for the challenge ahead. The team had carefully researched every aspect of the Antwerp Diamond Center, understanding its security systems, its routine, and its vulnerabilities better than anyone else. Their plan was as close to flawless as anyone could imagine. But beneath the surface of this meticulous operation, there was always the sense that one small mistake could unravel it all. Months of preparation had culminated in this moment. The King of Thieves knew the risks involved, but was confident that his crew could pull it off. The key to the heist lay in their ability to outwit the security systems without ever alerting the authorities. He had known for some time that the Diamond Center's biggest vulnerability was its reliance on a vast network of underground tunnels that ran beneath the building. These tunnels, originally constructed for utility and maintenance purposes, were mostly forgotten by the general public, but still remained in use by a few select personnel. The vault itself, however, was built with layers of steel, concrete, and cutting-edge technology. The external walls were reinforced to withstand explosions, and every inch of the facility was monitored by a complex surveillance system. But the one flaw was that no one had anticipated someone attempting to break in from below. The King of Thieves had found his window of opportunity. The crew knew the plan by heart, but they understood that success would depend on flawless execution. First, they would enter through a narrow service tunnel that was little more than a forgotten passageway beneath the city. This tunnel had once been used by workers and maintenance crews, and over time, it had fallen into disrepair. The crew had carefully cleared away debris and made sure the path was free from obstruction. It wasn't the easiest route, but it would get them within reach of the vault without being detected. They had also ensured that the tunnel's access points, both on the surface and below, were well hidden and would not be easily discovered by anyone monitoring the area. The hacker, a young woman known for her genius-level understanding of security systems, had spent weeks studying the vault's electronic infrastructure. She had found weaknesses in the security software, including a few loopholes in the vault's monitoring system. On the night of the heist, she would be responsible for disabling the alarm system, preventing the vault's security from alerting the authorities when the team breached its walls. The hacker's role was crucial. Without her, the entire operation would fail. She had carefully examined every electronic circuit, every camera feed, and every lock. By the time the heist was ready to unfold, she knew the system inside and out. Meanwhile, the locksmith had been practicing his craft for years. Known for his ability to open even the most complex locks in seconds, he was the team's silent operator. On this night, his job was to break into the vault itself once they reached the interior. The vault was protected by a series of complex locks and alarm systems, but the locksmith had already studied their design. His knowledge was invaluable. He knew how to manipulate the mechanisms to ensure a smooth entry without triggering the security measures. The team had every confidence that his skill would allow them to gain access without a hitch. Once inside, the crew would have only a limited window of time before their presence was detected, but they had prepared for this. They would work quickly, loading the diamonds and jewels into bags, avoiding unnecessary noise or disturbances. The King of Thieves had insisted on speed. He knew that in a heist like this, there was no room for hesitation. They had rehearsed the sequence of events countless times, ensuring that everyone knew their role and their timing. The escape, too, had been carefully planned. The getaway driver was waiting outside, prepared for a fast exit as soon as the diamonds were secured. He knew the city's streets well and had mapped out every potential route, ensuring that no matter what happened, the crew would be able to leave the scene without a trace. The heist itself would unfold in a series of calculated steps, each executed with precision. As midnight drew near, the crew gathered at their designated entry point, the narrow tunnel beneath the Antwerp Diamond Center. With everything in place, the King of Thieves gave the signal and the operation began. They entered the tunnel silently like shadows moving through the night, each member aware of their responsibility. The atmosphere was thick with tension as they moved deeper into the earth, their hearts pounding with adrenaline. Every noise seemed amplified, but they pushed on, focusing on the task at hand. The tunnel system was dark and damp, but it led them to their destination. After what seemed like hours, they emerged in a small room beneath the vault itself, the walls lined with thick metal. The locksmith went to work immediately, using his specialized tools to crack the outer security door. The hacker set to work, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she hacked into the system, disabling the cameras and alarms. And the King of Thieves, watching over his crew, could feel the thrill of the moment building. They were so close to completing what would be remembered as the most daring diamond heist in history. But as they worked, they remained unaware of one thing. Even the most perfect plans have a flaw. One small misstep would change everything. As the crew prepared to make their final move, a tiny mistake was quietly setting the stage for their inevitable downfall. But for now, they were unstoppable. The crew of thieves had worked like clockwork, each member playing their part flawlessly. By the time they reached the heart of the vault beneath the Antwerp Diamond Center, the thrill of anticipation surged through their veins. The King of Thieves, though outwardly calm, felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with executing a heist of this scale. Everything had gone according to plan so far. The tunnel entry had been smooth, the security doors had opened without a hitch, and the hacker had disabled the cameras and alarms with incredible precision. They were inside the vault. The air inside the vault room was thick with the smell of polished steel and concrete, a sterile atmosphere that reflected the vault's almost clinical security measures. But to the crew, it was the scent of success. The massive vault doors, which had once seemed insurmountable, now stood open before them. The cold, sterile environment was a stark contrast to the warmth of the heist's planning. The quiet hum of the machinery almost felt like a taunt. But there was no time to waste. The locksmith had already moved to the second set of doors, using his tools with practiced ease to bypass the complex locking mechanisms. These locks were considered unbreakable by most, designed to thwart even the most experienced thieves. But the locksmith was a master of his craft, and within minutes, he had the second set of doors open, giving the crew access to the treasure trove of diamonds and precious jewels stacked neatly inside. Each box and safe was filled with gems beyond imagination, radiant diamonds, glimmering sapphires, and emeralds that sparkled like stars. The King of Thieves stood silently for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. It was the culmination of years of planning and effort. He knew the diamonds in this vault represented not just wealth, but the prestige of pulling off the greatest heist ever. But there was no room for awe now. They had come this far. There could be no hesitation. The crew moved quickly. The locksmith, having completed his job, stepped back, letting the other members of the team take over. The hacker, whose job had been to disable the security systems, now moved to assist in collecting the diamonds. Working with precision, she began filling bags with carefully selected gems, ensuring that nothing was left behind. Her hands moved like a machine, calculating and methodical, each diamond placed with care to avoid triggering any of the hidden pressure sensors they hadn't accounted for. The King of Thieves watched the operation unfold before him, a quiet satisfaction building. His team was working like they had rehearsed it 1,000 times, their movements as seamless as a well-rehearsed ballet. There was no panic, no hesitation, Each crew member knew exactly what they had to do, and they did it with such grace and professionalism that it felt almost like they were part of a larger symphony. Each note played perfectly. The getaway driver, stationed outside, knew this was the most crucial part of the heist. Once they had loaded the gems, every second would count. The crew had already mapped out every potential escape route. There were no distractions, no delays, just the diamonds and the inevitable exit. The plan was simple. Gather the gems, get to the exit, and vanish into the night. They had covered every possible angle, leaving no loose ends. Yet as the crew worked in silence, they remained unaware of the tiny mistake they had made, one that, as time passed, would come back to haunt them. In their rush, they had forgotten to disable the final layer of security, a backup camera system, embedded in the vault's ceiling. The system, hidden and discreet, had been overlooked in their planning. While the main cameras had been disabled, the backup system remained active, capturing the entire operation from above. The King of Thieves had known how to cover all his tracks, but in this one detail, they had missed something crucial. The sound of distant sirens, faint but growing louder, began to cut through the quiet atmosphere. For a moment, no one seemed to notice. The crew was so focused on the task at hand, on filling bags with diamonds and clearing out the vault, that they didn't realize the time was slipping away. But slowly, something began to shift in the air. The King of Thieves, who had always been so attuned to the tiniest detail, began to feel a subtle sense of unease creeping in. The atmosphere in the vault was tense, but it was more than just the weight of the diamonds hanging in the air. It was a feeling that couldn't be placed. A nagging thought that something had gone wrong, though everything seemed perfect. They had spent hours preparing for this moment, rehearsing every move, and yet, despite all their careful planning, one small slip-up, one detail ignored, had set the stage for everything to unravel. No one had noticed the quiet blinking of the backup cameras high above them. No one had realized that in the heat of the moment, the second, more subtle layer of security had been left intact. It wasn't until the first flash of red lights illuminated the narrow windows of the vault's entrance that the crew began to realize something was wrong. They had triggered a silent alarm, one that had gone unnoticed until it was too late. The backup cameras had recorded everything. The heist, once so carefully choreographed, had been captured in crystal clear detail. They hadn't just missed a step in the plan, they had missed their own mistakes, and now they were facing the consequences of their oversight. By the time they realized the alarm had been set off, it was already too late to undo the damage. The sound of sirens grew louder, and in that moment, the crew's flawless execution came to a screeching halt. They had made it in, but getting out was going to be far more difficult than they had anticipated. As the sirens wailed in the distance, a cold sense of dread began to creep into the hearts of the thieves. The moment they had feared, the one misstep they hadn't accounted for, had arrived. The sound of the emergency sirens cut through the stillness of the vault, sending a shockwave through the crew. It was only then that they realized the gravity of their situation. What had seemed like the perfect heist was now teetering on the brink of disaster. The King of Thieves stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing through every possible scenario. He had seen the plan unravel before. He knew how quickly things could go wrong. But in this case, they had prepared for every contingency, or so they thought. The backup cameras had captured every movement inside the vault, and the silent alarm they had overlooked was now notifying the authorities. Even though they had taken great care to disable most of the security measures, this last slip-up had changed everything. The crew quickly snapped into action, but the calmness that had defined their earlier work had now been replaced by a palpable sense of urgency. The hacker, who had been responsible for disabling the alarms, stared at her laptop screen with growing panic. Despite her brilliance in hacking into the system, she hadn't anticipated the silent alarm system that had gone off the moment they had breached the vault. The flashing red lights outside grew brighter, signaling that the authorities were closing in. The noise of the sirens now filled the entire building, and time was slipping away faster than they could react. "Move!" the King of Thieves barked, breaking the silence. He knew their window of escape was narrowing, and they needed to leave immediately. The sound of the sirens made the urgency clear. It wasn't just the local police who would be responding, but the entire security apparatus of the Antwerp Diamond Center. Every minute spent inside the vault now put them closer to being caught. The locksmith, who had been preparing to load the last few bags of diamonds, immediately began moving toward the exit. His hands, normally steady and controlled, were now shaking with a tension he hadn't felt in years. He had unlocked the vault, removed the diamonds, but the task wasn't finished until they were out of there. The bags, heavy with the weight of priceless gems, felt like anchors pulling him back. He moved quickly, his mind racing to remember every escape route they had rehearsed. Inside the vault, the tension continued to mount. The King of Thieves could feel his pulse racing as the seconds ticked away. He tried to think, to strategize, but all he could focus on was the overwhelming noise of the sirens getting louder with every passing moment. His mind, once clear and sharp, felt foggy. He cursed under his breath, frustrated by the unexpected turn of events. He had always prided himself on being one step ahead, but now the authorities were on their tail, and the only thing that mattered was getting out. They had been so careful, so precise. How could they have overlooked the one thing that had brought them to the brink of capture? The hacker's frantic typing continued, her fingers flying over the keyboard, desperately trying to disable the backup systems. But it was too late. The alarm had already done its job. She knew there was no way to stop the authorities from arriving in time. It was no longer a question of how they would escape. It was a question of whether they could make it out alive. She looked up at the King of Thieves, her face pale and tight with fear. He gave her a nod, one that conveyed the unspoken truth. There was no time left to fix it. The crew was now scrambling to gather their bags and head toward the exit. The King of Thieves took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. The plan was falling apart, but there was still a chance. There had to be. They moved quickly through the dark passageway beneath the vault, retracing the route they had entered hours earlier. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the stolen diamonds now a burden on their shoulders. The adrenaline that had propelled them to this point was beginning to fade, replaced by the stark reality of what was happening. They could hear the distant sound of footsteps, of shouting, of the police closing in. Their chance at freedom was slipping away with every passing second. As they reached the entrance to the tunnel, they saw the first flashes of blue and red lights from outside. The getaway driver, now positioned in the van, revved the engine and began moving it toward the back entrance of the building, his eyes darting nervously between the rearview mirror and the approaching police cars. The crew's escape depended on him getting them out of there, and the slightest mistake would spell their capture. The King of Thieves gave the signal to move, and they raced toward the van, the bags of diamonds weighing them down. The loud hum of the engine filled the night air as they jumped into the van and slammed the doors shut. The getaway driver floored the accelerator, and the vehicle shot forward into the night. But even as the van sped down the darkened streets of Antwerp, they all knew that their problems had just begun. The heist was far from over. As the van hurtled through the darkened streets of Antwerp, the crew of thieves was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Relief had barely begun to settle in when the reality of their situation hit them like a cold wave. They had pulled off the impossible, stolen over $100 million in diamonds, but now they were on the run, and the consequences of their actions were only beginning to unfold. The police would be relentless in their pursuit, and the city's vast network of surveillance cameras and checkpoints would soon be tracking their every move. Inside the van, the King of Thieves sat in silence, his mind working at full speed. He had planned this heist for months, no, years, and had anticipated every possible outcome. But even the best-laid plans could fall apart when things went wrong. They had made it out of the vault, but they had overlooked the backup cameras, and now the entire operation was under the scrutiny of law enforcement. His pulse raced as he replayed the sequence of events in his mind, trying to find a way out of the mess they were now in. The diamonds were still in their possession, but their freedom was hanging by a thread. The getaway driver's knuckles gripped the steering wheel, his face tense as he navigated the maze of streets. He was skilled behind the wheel, but the pressure was mounting. He had been the one to ensure their escape route was secure, but now that they were fleeing, the stakes were higher than ever. Every siren, every flashing light was a reminder that they were being hunted. In his rearview mirror, he could see the flashing lights of the police growing closer, the gap closing with every turn. Faster, the king of thieves barked, his voice cold but urgent. The driver didn't need any further prompting. He floored the gas pedal, pushing the van into overdrive as they sped through the narrow streets of Antwerp. The crew was silent, each person absorbed in the gravity of the situation. The hacker, still clutching the bag of diamonds, was nervously scanning her phone, trying to track any developments on the police scanners. But she knew there was little they could do now. They had been compromised, and the authorities had already pieced together enough evidence to trace their escape route. The king of thieves glanced over at the hacker, his eyes hard and calculating. They had trusted her to disable the alarms, to ensure the flawless execution of their plan. And yet, it was her mistake. The overlooked backup cameras that had sealed their fate. He knew it wasn't entirely her fault. She had done everything she could. But that didn't make the situation any less dire. They were no longer in control, and the walls were closing in fast. The locksmith, normally the quietest member of the crew, finally spoke up, his voice strained with the tension. "Where do we go now? We need to ditch the van, find another way out." The king of thieves considered the question carefully. They couldn't go back to their safe house. It would be compromised by now. Every route they had planned had been mapped with meticulous care, but now the authorities had a head start on them. Their every move would be tracked. The team needed to disappear, vanish into the shadows. But first, they needed to get off the streets. "We'll head toward the outskirts of the city," the king of thieves said, his tone unwavering. "There's a warehouse where we can lay low for a while. We'll switch vehicles, get rid of these bags, and then we disappear. We can't afford to keep the diamonds on us for long." The van raced through the city's streets, weaving in and out of traffic, taking corners at breakneck speeds. The driver's hands were slick with sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, but he kept his focus, knowing that one mistake could lead to a fatal crash or a police blockade. Suddenly, the van jerked to a stop as the driver slammed on the brakes, narrowly avoiding a police checkpoint. The king of thieves cursed under his breath as he looked through the windshield. Ahead, there was a line of flashing police cars blocking the road. Their route had been cut off. "Get out!" The king of thieves shouted. There was no time to think. They needed a new plan, and they needed it fast. The van doors flew open, and the crew scrambled out, clutching the bags of diamonds to their chests. In the confusion, the king of thieves quickly scanned their surroundings. They had entered a narrow alley that led into an industrial area, and ahead, he could see the faint outline of a warehouse. It was their only option. Without hesitation, the crew sprinted toward the building, the sound of pounding footsteps echoing through the alley. As they reached the warehouse doors, the king of thieves paused just long enough to glance back at the van, now abandoned in the middle of the street. The authorities were closing in, but they had a few minutes before the police realized they had escaped. Inside the warehouse, they slammed the door shut behind them, panting from the exertion. The building was dark, filled with crates and old machinery. It was the perfect place to hide, at least for a little while. The crew gathered in the dim light, catching their breath. "We need to make a plan," the king of thieves said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We're not out of this yet. The police will be searching everywhere, but we've got one advantage. No one knows about this warehouse. We can lay low for a few days, then get rid of the diamonds." The team nodded, the gravity of their situation now settling in. They had made it out of the vault, but the real challenge had only just begun. The police were closing in, and their every move would be tracked. The king of thieves knew they had to vanish, but it wasn't going to be easy. Every step from here on out would be fraught with danger. The diamonds were still in their hands, but the price of freedom was rising with every passing minute. The crew was no longer just running from the law. They were running from the world itself. The heist was no longer a triumph, but a desperate race against time. The true test was about to begin.